The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon is a psychological effect in which a person notices something new and then begins to encounter it everywhere. A word, a name, a concept, or an object that once felt rare suddenly appears repeatedly. In conversations, on signs, in media, and in everyday life. The impression is strong and often unsettling, as if reality itself has shifted its focus. This phenomenon is also known as the frequency illusion. It does not mean that the object or idea has become more common in the world. Instead, the change happens inside the mind. Once attention is directed towards something unfamiliar, the brain begins to highlight every subsequent encounter with it. What was previously ignored now stands out clearly. The effect was named after an unusual coincidence reported in the late 20th century, when people mentioned hearing about the German terrorist group Baader, Meinhof, and then encountering references to it again shortly afterward. Over time, the name became associated not with the group itself, but with the psychological experience of sudden repetition. At the core of this phenomenon lies selective attention. The human brain constantly filters vast amounts of information. Most details pass unnoticed, not because they are absent, but because they are deemed irrelevant. When something new captures attention, the brain updates its internal priorities. From that moment on, related information is no longer filtered out. Another contributing factor is confirmation bias. After noticing something for the first time, each additional encounter reinforces the feeling that it is appearing more often. Encounters that support this impression are remembered, while moments that contradict it are easily forgotten. This creates a growing sense of frequency, even when the actual rate remains unchanged. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon often occurs with language. A person learns a new word and suddenly hears it repeatedly within a short period of time. The same effect can happen with names, car models, psychological terms, or even abstract ideas. The mind creates a quiet illusion of connection between unrelated events. Despite how convincing the experience feels, it does not indicate hidden messages or external patterns. The world has not changed its behavior. What has changed is awareness. The brain has adjusted its lens, allowing certain details to rise to the surface while others remain in the background. This phenomenon is not considered a disorder or a malfunction. It is a natural byproduct of how perception works. The brain is designed to learn quickly and adapt efficiently. Once something is labeled as important or novel, it receives increased cognitive attention for a period of time. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon can feel almost magical, as though reality is responding directly to thought. Yet it is entirely internal, rooted in ordinary cognitive processes. The sense of repetition fades as familiarity grows, and the mind eventually returns the object to the background where it once belonged. In a quiet way, this effect reveals how much of the world we do not see. Not because it is hidden, but because attention has not yet been directed toward it. The phenomenon is a reminder that perception is not a passive mirror of reality, but an active process shaped by focus, memory, and expectation. As the mind moves on to new information, the illusion dissolves. What once seemed everywhere becomes invisible again, replaced by the next unfamiliar detail waiting to be noticed for the first time. Jamais Vu. Jamais Vu is a psychological effect in which a familiar situation suddenly feels unfamiliar. A word that has been spoken countless times loses its meaning. A place visited many times feels distant and strange. An action performed automatically now requires conscious effort. The experience is brief, but deeply unsettling. Unlike déjà vu, which creates a false sense of familiarity, Jamais Vu does the opposite. It removes familiarity from what should be known. The mind recognizes that something should feel familiar, yet the emotional and cognitive connection is absent. This mismatch creates a quiet sense of disorientation. Jamais Vu often occurs during routine activities. Writing a common word repeatedly may cause it to look incorrect or meaningless. Driving a familiar route can suddenly feel unfamiliar, as if seen for the first time. Even one's own reflection can briefly feel detached, observed rather than recognized. Researchers believe this effect is linked to cognitive saturation. When the brain processes the same stimulus repeatedly, neural circuits may temporarily lose efficiency. Instead of reinforcing recognition, repetition can weaken it, causing the mental representation to momentarily collapse. Familiarity, which usually operates automatically, requires reconstruction. Another contributing factor is attention. Familiarity depends on smooth, unconscious processing. When attention is redirected inward, toward the act of recognizing itself, automatic processes become disrupted. The mind begins to observe what it normally performs without awareness. This interruption breaks the illusion of continuity. Jamais Vu is commonly reported in people without any neurological or psychiatric conditions. It can occur during periods of mental fatigue, stress, or intense focus. However, it can also arise unexpectedly, without any obvious trigger. This unpredictability adds to its unsettling quality. Language is especially vulnerable to this effect. Words are symbolic constructs maintained by repeated use. When repetition exceeds a certain threshold, the symbolic link between sound, spelling, and meaning can weaken. The word remains visible or audible, but its significance dissolves. During Jamais Vu, reality does not feel altered in a dramatic way. There are no hallucinations or distortions of the external world. Instead, the change is subtle and internal. The world looks the same, but the sense of recognition that usually anchors experience is missing. This effect highlights how much of daily life relies on unconscious processing. Familiarity is not a fixed property of objects or places. It is a mental state continuously generated by the brain. When that process falters, even briefly, the stability of perception is affected. Jamais Vu typically resolves on its own within seconds or minutes. Familiarity gradually returns, often without a clear transition. The mind resumes its automatic patterns, and the world regains its usual sense of coherence. The experience is remembered, but its intensity fades quickly. Despite being harmless, Jamais Vu can feel disturbing. It exposes how fragile the sense of certainty can be. The feeling that something is known is not guaranteed. It must be actively maintained by cognitive systems working quietly in the background. There is no clear cause that explains exactly why Jamais Vu occurs at a specific moment. Science can describe the conditions under which it is more likely, but the precise trigger remains unclear. The effect emerges spontaneously, disrupting familiarity without warning. Jamais Vu reminds us that recognition is not a passive reflection of reality. It is an active construction. When that construction briefly fails, the familiar world becomes strangely distant, revealing the delicate mechanisms that usually remain unseen. Capgras Delusion. Capgras Delusion is a psychological condition in which a person believes that someone close to them has been replaced by an identical imposter. The appearance, voice, and behavior of the person seem unchanged, yet something essential feels missing. Recognition remains intact, but emotional certainty disappears. The individual experiencing Capgras Delusion does not usually claim that the imposter looks different. On the contrary, the resemblance is often described as perfect. What is absent is not visual recognition, but the sense of emotional familiarity that normally accompanies it. The mind identifies the face, but the emotional response fails to activate. This creates a profound internal contradiction. Logic confirms identity, while emotion rejects it. To resolve this conflict, the brain constructs an alternative explanation. The idea of replacement becomes the only way to make sense of the emotional disconnect. The belief is not adopted casually. It feels necessary and coherent within the person's experience. Capgras Delusion most often involves close family members or romantic partners. These relationships rely heavily on emotional recognition. When that emotional signal is disrupted, the loss is immediately noticeable. The absence feels too significant to ignore, demanding interpretation. Neurological research suggests that this condition may be related to a disruption between facial recognition systems and emotional processing centers in the brain. Visual information reaches conscious awareness, but the emotional response that usually confirms familiarity does not follow. The face is seen, but it feels empty of meaning. Despite this, individuals with Capgras Delusion often function normally in other areas of life. Their reasoning, memory, and perception may remain intact. The delusion is specific and focused, rather than global. This specificity makes the experience even more convincing to the person affected. The emotional consequences of Capgras delusion can be severe. Trust erodes, relationships fracture, and fear may emerge. If a loved one is perceived as an imposter, their intentions become uncertain. Familiar environments lose their sense of safety. The world becomes subtly unstable. Importantly, Capgras delusion is not a metaphorical feeling or a fleeting doubt. It is a fixed belief that persists despite reassurance or evidence. Attempts to argue against it often fail, not because the person lacks intelligence, but because the belief is grounded in direct emotional experience. From the outside, the delusion may appear irrational. From the inside, it feels logical and unavoidable. The mind is responding to a genuine absence of emotional recognition. The explanation may be incorrect, but the experience itself is real. Capgras delusion has been observed in association with neurological injury, dementia, and certain psychiatric conditions, but it can also appear without a clear cause. In some cases, it emerges suddenly without warning, altering perception overnight. There is no single explanation that fully accounts for why this condition arises in some individuals and not others. Similar neurological disruptions do not always produce the same belief. This unpredictability remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the delusion. At its core, Capgras delusion reveals how much human identity depends on emotion, not just perception. Recognition is not merely about seeing a face. It is about feeling its presence as meaningful and familiar. When that feeling disappears, identity itself becomes uncertain. The condition exposes a fragile boundary between knowing and feeling. It demonstrates that belief can form not from imagination, but from an attempt to restore coherence to a broken internal signal. The mind chooses explanation over chaos. Capgras delusion remains a powerful example of how the brain constructs reality. When emotional pathways fail, the mind does not remain silent. It creates a narrative that allows experience to make sense, even if that narrative separates a loved one from who they truly are. Cotard syndrome. Cotard syndrome is a rare psychological condition in which a person believes that they no longer exist, are dead, or have lost their internal organs. The experience is not metaphorical and not symbolic. It is a literal conviction, perceived as factual and undeniable within the person's internal reality. Those experiencing Cotard syndrome may describe themselves as empty, hollow, or absent. Some believe their body is decaying, while others feel that life has already ended, even though they continue to move, speak, and interact. The world appears unchanged, yet the sense of personal existence has vanished. Unlike conditions centered on external perception, Cotard syndrome is focused inward. The individual does not misidentify others or the environment. Instead, the disruption occurs in self-recognition. The feeling of being alive, normally constant and unquestioned, is missing. This absence creates a paradox. The body functions, thoughts continue, and sensations are still felt, but the core sense of existence feels false or disconnected. To reconcile this contradiction, the mind forms the belief that life itself has ended or was never truly present. Emotional numbness is often central to this experience. Feelings that usually signal vitality, such as hunger, pleasure, or emotional response, may feel muted or absent. Without these signals, the mind interprets the body as non-functional or unreal. Cotard syndrome has been observed in association with severe depression, neurological injury, and certain psychiatric conditions. However, no single cause explains why the syndrome appears in some individuals and not in others. Similar conditions do not consistently produce the same belief. The syndrome varies in intensity. Some individuals believe they are partially dead, while others feel completely non-existent. In extreme cases, the belief can lead to neglect of basic needs, as the person sees no reason to care for a body they believe no longer exists. Despite the severity of the belief, individuals with Cotard syndrome are often able to articulate their experience clearly. Their speech can be calm, structured, and rational. The conviction is not chaotic. It is internally consistent, shaped by a profound disruption in self-perception. From a neurological perspective, researchers suggest that Cotard syndrome may involve impaired integration between emotional processing and self-awareness. The mind receives sensory input, but the emotional confirmation of existence does not follow. Without that confirmation, existence feels implausible. The syndrome highlights how much the sense of being alive depends on emotional feedback rather than logical reasoning. Existence is not something we consciously verify. It is something we feel continuously. When that feeling disappears, logic alone cannot restore it. Cotard syndrome remains one of the most striking examples of how identity and reality are constructed internally. The belief of non-existence does not arise from fantasy, but from an attempt to explain a profound internal absence. There is no universally accepted explanation for why this condition manifests in such an extreme form. Science can describe the associated disruptions, but the precise mechanism that transforms emotional numbness into a belief of death remains unclear. The syndrome reveals a fragile truth about consciousness. The feeling of being alive is not guaranteed. It is maintained moment by complex systems working silently in the background. When those systems fail, even briefly, existence itself can feel uncertain. Cotard syndrome stands as a rare and unsettling reminder that reality is not only perceived through the senses, but also felt through an internal sense of presence. When that presence disappears, the mind constructs meaning from absence, and silence becomes proof of non-existence. The third man syndrome. The third man syndrome is a psychological phenomenon in which a person senses the presence of an unseen companion during moments of extreme stress, isolation, or physical exhaustion. The presence is not visible, audible, or physically tangible, yet it feels undeniably real. It is often perceived as calm, supportive, and protective. Those who experience this phenomenon rarely describe it as frightening. Instead, the presence is felt as reassuring, as though someone is nearby, guiding or watching over them. The individual does not usually believe the presence to be imagined. It is experienced as a genuine perception rather than a deliberate belief. The phenomenon has been reported most often in situations involving severe danger or prolonged isolation. Explorers, mountaineers, sailors, and individuals lost in remote environments have described feeling accompanied despite being physically alone. The presence often appears when survival seems uncertain. Unlike hallucinations, the third man syndrome does not typically involve clear sensory details. There is no face, voice, or form. The presence exists as a sense rather than an image. It occupies mental space without occupying physical space, making it difficult to describe in concrete terms. Psychologically, the experience appears to emerge when the mind is under extreme strain. Fatigue, fear, and sensory deprivation reduce the brain's ability to maintain its usual boundaries between self and environment. In this state, internal processes may be perceived as external support. The presence often seems intelligent and purposeful. Some individuals report feeling guided toward safety or encouraged to continue moving. Others describe a steady companionship that reduces panic and preserves mental stability. The presence does not command or control. It simply exists. The third man syndrome does not usually persist beyond the crisis. Once safety is restored, the presence fades without ceremony. There is no gradual disappearance, only an absence where something once felt constant. The individual often reflects on the experience with a mix of gratitude and confusion. Importantly, the phenomenon is not limited to individuals with mental illness. Many who report it have no history of psychological disorders. The experience appears to be situational rather than pathological, arising in response to extreme conditions rather than internal dysfunction. Researchers suggest that the syndrome may be related to the brain's survival mechanisms. Under threat, the mind prioritizes endurance and focus. Creating a sense of companionship may help maintain motivation, reduce fear, and stabilize cognition when external support is unavailable. Despite these theories, there is no definitive explanation for why the presence takes on a distinctly separate identity rather than remaining an internal sensation. Not all individuals in extreme conditions experience it, and those who do describe it in remarkably similar ways. The consistency of these reports has made the third man syndrome one of the most intriguing psychological phenomena associated with survival. The experience appears structured rather than chaotic, purposeful rather than random. The phenomenon reveals how adaptable human perception can be under pressure. The mind does not simply endure isolation. It reshapes experience to preserve psychological continuity. In moments when solitude becomes unbearable, presence emerges. The third man syndrome blurs the boundary between internal and external reality. The presence feels real because, within the context of survival, it serves a real function. It supports the mind when the body is pushed beyond ordinary limits. There is no clear cause that explains why this phenomenon manifests in some individuals and not others. It arises silently, fulfills its role, and disappears without leaving a trace. What remains is the memory of not being alone when isolation was absolute. The third man syndrome stands as a quiet testament to the mind's ability to protect itself. When the world offers no companion, the brain may create one, not out of fantasy, but out of necessity. Stendhal Syndrome. Stendhal Syndrome is a psychological phenomenon in which an individual experiences intense emotional and physical reactions when exposed to art, beauty, or culturally significant environments. These reactions may include dizziness, confusion, emotional overwhelm, rapid heartbeat, or a sense of disorientation. The response arises without a clear pathological cause and often surprises the person experiencing it. The syndrome is named after the French writer Stendhal, who described a powerful emotional reaction during his visit to Florence. While his account was literary, similar experiences have since been documented in clinical and observational settings. The phenomenon does not depend on artistic knowledge or expectation. It can occur spontaneously, without preparation or conscious anticipation. Individuals affected by Stendhal syndrome often report a sense of being emotionally flooded. The intensity of perception exceeds the mind's capacity to integrate it smoothly. Visual detail, symbolic meaning, and emotional resonance converge too quickly, overwhelming normal cognitive processing. The experience is not limited to famous artworks. Architectural spaces, historical locations, and concentrated displays of cultural meaning can produce the same effect. What matters is not the object itself, but the cumulative impact of aesthetic and emotional stimulation. Stendhal syndrome does not involve hallucinations or loss of contact with reality. The environment remains intact and clearly perceived. The disturbance occurs within emotional and physiological regulation. The body responds as though exposed to an excessive stimulus, despite the absence of physical danger. Researchers suggest that the syndrome may arise when emotional sensitivity, personal significance, and sensory input align too closely. The brain attempts to process meaning, beauty, and emotion simultaneously, creating a state of overload. This response bypasses rational appraisal and manifests directly through the nervous system. The syndrome is often temporary. Symptoms typically resolve once the individual leaves the environment or the intensity diminishes. The return to emotional equilibrium is gradual rather than abrupt, leaving behind a sense of exhaustion or quiet reflection. Importantly, Stendhal syndrome is not considered a mental disorder. It does not imply instability or vulnerability. Many who experience it are otherwise psychologically healthy. The reaction reflects a heightened responsiveness rather than dysfunction. Cultural context appears to play a role, but it does not fully explain the phenomenon. Individuals unfamiliar with the historical or artistic significance of a location may still experience strong reactions. This suggests that the effect operates below conscious interpretation. The syndrome reveals the powerful connection between perception and emotion. Beauty is not merely observed. It is processed, evaluated, and integrated into personal meaning. When that integration becomes too rapid or intense, emotional balance can be disrupted. Stendhal syndrome challenges the assumption that aesthetic experiences are always gentle or uplifting. Under certain conditions, beauty can be destabilizing. The mind does not always absorb it gradually. Sometimes it arrives all at once. There is no clear mechanism that predicts who will experience this phenomenon. Similar individuals exposed to the same environment may respond very differently. This unpredictability remains one of the defining features of the syndrome. The experience often leaves a lasting impression. Even after symptoms fade, the memory of the moment remains vivid. It is remembered not as fear, but as intensity, a moment when perception exceeded comfort. Stendhal Syndrome stands as a reminder that the human mind is deeply affected by beauty and meaning. These elements are not neutral stimuli. When concentrated, they can challenge the mind's ability to remain stable and composed. The phenomenon occupies a quiet space between psychology and experience. It is not a failure of the mind, but an expression of its sensitivity. When emotional resonance reaches a certain threshold, the mind responds not with analysis but with surrender. Alice in Wonderland Syndrome. Alice in Wonderland Syndrome is a neurological and perceptual condition in which a person experiences distortions in the perception of size, distance, time, and bodily awareness. Objects may appear unusually large or impossibly small. Spaces may feel stretched or compressed. The body itself may seem altered, as if its proportions no longer align with reality. These distortions do not involve hallucinations. The person understands that what they are experiencing does not match objective reality. However, the sensation itself feels vivid and convincing. Perception is altered, not belief. The world is seen through a temporarily distorted internal scale. One of the most striking aspects of this syndrome is the distortion of body image. Hands may feel enormous, while legs may seem shortened or distant. The sense of physical boundaries becomes unstable. The body feels present, yet inaccurately measured by the mind. Time perception can also be affected. Moments may stretch unnaturally, while actions feel delayed or accelerated. This creates a sense of detachment from the usual flow of experience. The rhythm of reality becomes irregular, disrupting the sense of continuity. Alice in Wonderland Syndrome often occurs in brief episodes. These episodes can last from a few minutes to several hours and typically resolve on their own. Between episodes, perception returns to normal, leaving no visible trace of the distortion. The syndrome is most commonly reported in children, but it also occurs in adults. It has been associated with migraines, viral infections, and neurological disturbances, yet it can also appear without a clearly identifiable cause. This variability complicates efforts to define a single mechanism. Emotionally, the experience can range from neutral to deeply unsettling. While some individuals observe the distortions with curiosity, others feel anxiety or discomfort. The instability of perception challenges the sense of control over one's own experience. Importantly, consciousness remains intact throughout the episode. The individual is aware, oriented, and capable of reflection. This awareness differentiates the syndrome from psychotic conditions. The disturbance is perceptual, not delusional. Researchers believe the syndrome may involve disruptions in how the brain integrates visual, sensory, and spatial information. When these systems lose synchronization, perception becomes fragmented. The brain continues to function, but its internal measurements no longer align. The name of the syndrome reflects its similarity to the experiences described in Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. However, the condition itself is clinical rather than symbolic. The reference serves only as a metaphor for altered scale and proportion. Alice in Wonderland Syndrome reveals how perception depends on internal calibration rather than external reality. Size, distance, and time are not passively observed. They are actively constructed by the brain. When this construction falters, reality does not disappear. Instead, it becomes distorted. The world remains recognizable, yet unfamiliar in its proportions. The mind is present, but its measuring tools are unreliable. There is no definitive explanation for why the syndrome manifests differently across individuals. Some experience primarily visual distortions, while others report bodily or temporal changes. The diversity of symptoms suggests multiple contributing pathways rather than a single cause. Despite its dramatic nature, the syndrome is usually benign. Episodes tend to resolve without long-term consequences. However, the memory of the experience often remains vivid, reinforcing how deeply perception shapes reality. Alice in Wonderland Syndrome stands as a reminder that the world we perceive is not fixed. It is continuously assembled by neural processes that operate quietly and automatically. When those processes shift, even briefly, the familiar world can transform in unexpected ways. The syndrome occupies a space where reality feels fragile, not because it is unreal, but because perception itself is flexible. In those moments, the mind reveals how easily scale, distance, and self can lose their usual certainty. Fregoli Delusion. Fregoli delusion is a rare psychological condition in which a person believes that multiple different individuals are, in fact, a single person who is changing appearance or disguising themselves. Faces, voices, and bodies appear different, yet they are interpreted as belonging to one underlying identity. The world becomes populated not by many people, but by one persistent presence. Unlike ordinary misidentification, this delusion does not arise from confusion or poor perception. Visual recognition often functions normally. The individual sees clear physical differences, yet these differences are overridden by a powerful sense of sameness. Identity becomes detached from appearance. The delusion often involves a specific individual believed to be following, observing, or interacting with the person across different contexts. This belief is not symbolic or metaphorical. It is experienced as a factual interpretation of reality, supported by an internal sense of certainty. Emotion plays a central role in Fregoli delusion. The perceived presence of a single identity across multiple faces often carries emotional significance. The person may feel watched, pursued, or connected to others in a way that feels unavoidable. Emotional salience overrides logical contradiction. From a cognitive perspective, the delusion may arise from an abnormal linking of emotional recognition to identity processing. Instead of using visual features to distinguish individuals, the mind assigns identity based on emotional familiarity or perceived intent. As a result, different people are experienced as expressions of the same underlying person. This condition is often associated with neurological or psychiatric disturbances, yet it can emerge suddenly and without an obvious cause. In some cases, it appears after brain injury or during acute psychological episodes. In others, no clear trigger is identified. Fregoli delusion tends to be persistent. The belief is not easily altered by evidence or reassurance. Logical explanations fail to override the internal conviction, because the experience is grounded in perception rather than reasoning. The mind interprets consistency of feeling as consistency of identity. The experience can be socially isolating. Interactions lose their neutrality when strangers are perceived as the same person in different forms. The sense of individuality in others dissolves, replaced by repetition. Social environments become simplified, but also more threatening. Despite the strength of the delusion, cognitive functions outside identity recognition may remain intact. Memory, language, and reasoning can appear normal. This contrast highlights how localized and specific the disturbance can be. Fregoli delusion reveals how identity is constructed by the brain. It is not solely derived from physical features. Emotional context, expectation, and perceived intention all contribute. When these systems become misaligned, identity becomes fluid and unstable. The delusion challenges the assumption that recognizing others is a straightforward process. In reality, it relies on the integration of perception, emotion, and memory. When that integration fails, the distinction between individuals collapses. There is no single explanation that fully accounts for why this delusion takes the form of multiplicity rather than replacement, as seen in other misidentification syndromes. The variation suggests that identity processing is not a single pathway, but a network of interacting systems. Fregoli delusion transforms the social world into a stage of repetition. Different faces become variations of one presence. Movement through public spaces feels scripted, as if encounters are predetermined rather than random. The condition stands as a striking example of how the mind seeks coherence. Faced with distorted emotional signals, it resolves uncertainty by unifying identity rather than fragmenting it. One person becomes many, rather than many becoming one. Fregoli Delusion remains a powerful illustration of how perception can override logic. When emotional familiarity is misplaced, reality reorganizes itself around that error. The world does not disappear, but it becomes populated by echoes of the same identity, repeated across different forms. Exploding head syndrome. Exploding head syndrome is a sensory phenomenon in which a person experiences a sudden, loud noise at the moment of falling asleep or waking up. The sound may resemble an explosion, a gunshot, a crash, or an electrical burst. Despite its intensity, there is no external source and no physical damage. The experience occurs entirely within the mind, yet it feels vivid and immediate. The sound is often accompanied by a brief sense of shock or alarm. Some individuals also report a flash of light or a sudden muscular jolt, but there is no pain associated with the event. Exploding head syndrome typically occurs during transitions between wakefulness and sleep. These moments involve complex neurological shifts, as the brain moves between states of consciousness. When this transition is disrupted, sensory signals may be misfired or misinterpreted. The phenomenon is usually brief, lasting only a fraction of a second. However, its suddenness can make it deeply disturbing. The person may awaken fully, alert and confused, unsure of what just occurred. The surrounding environment remains silent and unchanged. Importantly, exploding head syndrome is not associated with seizures, strokes, or structural brain damage. Medical examinations often reveal no abnormalities. The experience does not indicate physical harm, despite how dramatic it feels. The syndrome can occur sporadically or recur over time. Some individuals experience it once in their lifetime, while others report repeated episodes across months or years. The frequency varies widely, and no consistent pattern predicts its appearance. Stress, fatigue, and irregular sleep schedules have been noted as common conditions surrounding episodes. However, these factors do not fully explain why the phenomenon occurs at a specific moment. Many episodes arise without any identifiable trigger. Exploding head syndrome affects people of all ages, though it is more commonly reported in adulthood. It often emerges unexpectedly, even in individuals with no history of sleep disorders or neurological conditions. From a neurological perspective, the syndrome is believed to involve a brief malfunction in how the brain shuts down sensory processing during sleep onset. Instead of fading gradually, certain neural circuits activate abruptly, producing the illusion of sound. The experience is not imagined in a deliberate sense. The sound is perceived as real, not thought about or anticipated. It arises independently of conscious control, reinforcing its unsettling nature. Despite its name, exploding head syndrome does not involve actual explosions, pressure, or physical sensation within the head. The term reflects the subjective intensity of the sound rather than a physical event. The emotional impact of the syndrome varies. Some individuals become anxious about sleep, anticipating future episodes. Others remain calm after understanding the benign nature of the experience. Awareness often reduces fear but does not always prevent recurrence. Exploding head syndrome demonstrates how perception can detach from external reality during altered states of consciousness. The brain remains active, but its internal coordination becomes momentarily unstable. There is no definitive explanation for why certain individuals experience this phenomenon while others do not. Similar sleep transitions occur in everyone, yet only some result in sensory disruptions. The syndrome highlights the fragile boundary between waking and sleeping states. During this transition, perception is neither fully conscious nor fully unconscious. Sensory experiences can emerge without context or meaning. Exploding head syndrome stands as a reminder that the mind does not always move smoothly between states. Even in rest, the brain remains active, capable of producing intense experiences without external cause. Though startling, the phenomenon is typically harmless. It leaves no lasting effects beyond memory and, in some cases, temporary unease. The sound fades, silence returns, and sleep eventually resumes. The rubber hand illusion. The rubber hand illusion is a perceptual phenomenon in which a person begins to experience an artificial hand as part of their own body. The effect occurs when a visible fake hand and the person's hidden real hand are stroked in synchrony. Over time, the brain integrates the artificial limb into its body representation. The illusion does not rely on imagination or belief. Participants are often fully aware that the hand they see is not biologically theirs. Despite this knowledge, the sensation of ownership emerges automatically. The artificial hand begins to feel connected, as if it belongs. This phenomenon demonstrates how the sense of bodily ownership is constructed. The brain continuously combines visual input, touch, and spatial information to determine what is part of the self. When these signals align, ownership can be reassigned. During the illusion, the real hand feels less present. Sensation may seem muted or distant, while the artificial hand gains prominence. The shift does not require conscious effort. It occurs gradually as the brain updates its internal model. Physiological responses often accompany the illusion. When the artificial hand is threatened, the body may react with stress responses such as increased heart rate or sweating. These reactions occur even though the person knows the threat is not real. The rubber hand illusion reveals that the body is not experienced as a fixed object. Instead, it is represented as a flexible construct maintained by ongoing sensory integration. Ownership is inferred rather than guaranteed. The illusion typically develops within minutes and fades once sensory synchronization stops. When the signals are no longer aligned, the artificial hand loses its sense of belonging. The brain returns ownership to the biological limb. Importantly, this phenomenon occurs in psychologically healthy individuals. It does not indicate confusion or suggestibility. It reflects normal mechanisms of perception and embodiment functioning as designed. The illusion has been observed across cultures and age groups, suggesting it is rooted in universal aspects of human cognition. It does not depend on expectation or prior knowledge. Even those unfamiliar with the effect often experience it strongly. The rubber hand illusion also demonstrates how visual information can dominate other senses. Seeing a hand being touched can override proprioceptive signals from the body. Vision becomes the anchor for self-representation. Despite its simplicity, the illusion is remarkably convincing. The brain prioritizes coherence over accuracy. When sensory inputs align, the simplest explanation is accepted, even if it contradicts objective reality. There is no clear explanation for why some individuals experience the illusion more intensely than others. Sensory sensitivity, attention, and neural integration may play a role, but no single factor fully accounts for the variation. The phenomenon challenges the assumption that the body is experienced directly. Instead, it is perceived through interpretation. The mind decides what belongs to the self based on consistency, not biology. The rubber hand illusion provides insight into how the sense of self is maintained. It is not anchored to physical boundaries alone, but to patterns of sensation and perception. When those patterns change, the boundaries of the self shift. The illusion reveals that the feeling of my body is an ongoing process, reconstructed moment by the brain. Phantom vibration syndrome. Phantom vibration syndrome is a psychological phenomenon in which a person senses their phone vibrating or ringing when it is not. The sensation feels real and immediate, often prompting an automatic physical response. The device may be checked instinctively, only to reveal silence and no notification. This experience does not involve imagination in a deliberate sense. The sensation is perceived as physical, localized, and convincing. It may occur in a pocket, a bag, or against the skin, mimicking the familiar pattern of a real vibration. The syndrome has become increasingly common with the widespread use of mobile devices. Repeated exposure to vibration alerts conditions the nervous system to anticipate signals. Over time, the brain becomes highly sensitive to patterns associated with incoming communication. Phantom vibrations often occur during periods of heightened attention or expectation. The mind remains alert for potential notifications, even in the absence of external input. This state of readiness allows internal signals to be misinterpreted as external stimuli. Neurologically, the sensation is believed to arise from minor sensory misfires combined with expectation. Normal bodily sensations such as muscle tension, clothing movement, or nerve activity are reinterpreted as vibrations because they match a familiar pattern. The phenomenon is typically brief and harmless. The sensation fades quickly once attention shifts or the phone is checked. However, its frequency can make it feel persistent or intrusive. Phantom vibration syndrome does not indicate addiction or dependency by itself. It reflects the brain's ability to adapt to repeated stimuli. When a signal becomes important and frequent, the mind learns to detect it rapidly, sometimes too rapidly. The experience occurs across age groups and professions. It has been reported by students, professionals, and individuals with varying levels of phone usage. The common factor is repeated exposure and expectation, not psychological vulnerability. Emotionally, the sensation is usually neutral. It may cause brief confusion or mild frustration, but rarely fear. The brain corrects itself almost immediately once reality is confirmed. Importantly, the syndrome does not involve hallucination in the clinical sense. There is no sustained false perception. Instead, there is a momentary misinterpretation of sensory input. Phantom vibrations highlight how modern technology has altered sensory habits. The body becomes integrated into digital communication patterns. The boundary between physical sensation and technological signal becomes blurred. The syndrome also reveals the predictive nature of perception. The brain does not wait passively for input. It constantly anticipates what is likely to happen next. When expectation is strong enough, perception can briefly lead rather than follow. There is no clear threshold at which the phenomenon appears. Some individuals experience it frequently, while others never do. Similar usage patterns do not guarantee similar responses. Phantom vibration syndrome tends to decrease when phone usage patterns change. Reduced exposure or altered notification settings often reduce the frequency of the sensation. The brain gradually recalibrates its expectations. The phenomenon is a subtle example of how perception adapts to environment. It does not represent malfunction, but efficiency taken too far. The mind becomes so prepared to detect a signal that it occasionally detects one that is not there. Phantom vibration syndrome reminds us that sensation is not purely physical. It is shaped by habit, expectation, and attention. In a world of constant alerts, the brain learns to listen even when nothing is calling. Jerusalem Syndrome. Jerusalem Syndrome is a psychological phenomenon in which individuals develop intense religious or spiritual beliefs while visiting Jerusalem. These beliefs often emerge suddenly and temporarily, even in people with no prior history of mental illness or strong religious conviction. The experience is immersive and deeply personal. Those affected may feel compelled to identify with religious figures, historical prophets, or spiritual roles connected to the city. The belief is not symbolic or metaphorical. It is experienced as literal and immediate, forming part of the person's perception of reality during the episode. The syndrome typically unfolds in stages. Individuals may first experience heightened emotional sensitivity and a sense of significance. This is followed by a desire for purification or moral clarity. Eventually, the belief of a special spiritual mission or identity may emerge. Jerusalem Syndrome does not involve hallucinations or sensory distortions. The environment is perceived clearly. Streets, buildings, and people remain recognizable. The change occurs in interpretation and meaning rather than perception. The city of Jerusalem holds profound historical, cultural, and religious significance. For some individuals, prolonged exposure to this symbolic density creates emotional overload. The mind responds by organizing experience through a spiritual framework. Episodes are usually temporary. Symptoms often diminish once the individual leaves the environment or after a short period of rest and support. The beliefs typically fade without leaving lasting psychological effects. Importantly, Jerusalem Syndrome can occur in individuals with no psychiatric diagnosis. Many who experience it return to their previous belief systems without difficulty. This distinguishes the syndrome from chronic religious delusions. The phenomenon has been observed across different religious backgrounds. While the specific content of the beliefs varies, the structure of the experience remains similar. The individual feels chosen, guided, or transformed by the location. Researchers suggest that the syndrome arises from the interaction between personal vulnerability and environmental intensity. The city acts not as a cause, but as a catalyst. The psychological shift emerges internally in response to external meaning. Jerusalem Syndrome reveals how strongly context can shape belief. Identity and conviction are not always fixed traits. Under certain conditions, they can reorganize rapidly. The syndrome challenges the assumption that belief always develops gradually. In this case, meaning arrives all at once, overwhelming ordinary interpretive frameworks. There is no clear explanation for why only some visitors experience this phenomenon. Many encounter the same environment without psychological effect. This selectivity remains unexplained. Jerusalem Syndrome demonstrates that spiritual experience can arise independently of pathology. The mind can generate profound conviction without losing contact with reality in other areas. The experience often feels purposeful rather than chaotic. Individuals describe clarity, certainty, and emotional intensity. Doubt is temporarily absent. Once the episode resolves, individuals may recall the experience with confusion or embarrassment. However, memory remains intact, and insight often returns naturally. Jerusalem Syndrome stands as a unique example of how place, meaning, and identity can converge. When symbolic weight becomes overwhelming, the mind may respond by transforming itself. The phenomenon exists at the intersection of psychology, culture, and belief. It is not caused by faith alone, nor by environment alone, but by their convergence within a receptive mind. Chronostasis. Chronostasis is a perceptual phenomenon in which time appears to momentarily stop or stretch, most commonly noticed when shifting one's gaze. The classic example occurs when a person looks at a clock and perceives the second hand as frozen for an instant longer than it should be. The movement resumes normally, yet the pause feels real. This effect does not involve an actual interruption of time. The clock continues to function correctly. The distortion arises within perception, not in the external world. The brain reconstructs the moment in a way that creates the illusion of extended time. Chronostasis occurs during rapid eye movements known as saccades. During these movements, visual input is briefly suppressed to prevent motion blur. The brain does not register this gap as missing information. Instead, it fills in the interval retroactively. To maintain a continuous experience of reality, the mind extends the image seen immediately after the eye movement backward in time. This adjustment creates the impression that the current moment lasted longer than it actually did. The pause feels natural even though it never truly occurred. The phenomenon is not limited to clocks. It can occur with any sudden visual fixation, such as glancing at a moving object or shifting attention quickly. The sense of temporal distortion arises quietly, often unnoticed unless attention is drawn to it. Chronostasis reveals that perception of time is not continuous. It is assembled from fragments of sensory information, stitched together into a coherent narrative. The brain prioritizes continuity over accuracy. This process operates automatically and without awareness. The individual does not decide to alter time perception. The brain performs the adjustment instantly to preserve a stable visual world. Importantly, chronostasis is not a sign of neurological dysfunction. It occurs in healthy individuals and reflects normal perceptual processing. The illusion is brief, subtle, and typically harmless. The phenomenon demonstrates that time, as experienced, is not measured directly. It is inferred from changes in perception. When those changes are momentarily disrupted, the sense of duration shifts. Chronostasis also illustrates the predictive nature of perception. The brain anticipates what should be seen and adjusts perception to match expectation. When expectation and sensory input misalign, perception compensates. There is no single trigger that guarantees the experience of chronostasis. It depends on attention, eye movement, and context. Many instances occur without conscious notice. The illusion fades immediately as perception stabilizes. Time resumes its usual rhythm, and the mind moves on without registering the adjustment. Chronostasis occupies a subtle space in everyday experience. It is not dramatic or overwhelming. It slips into awareness briefly, then disappears. The phenomenon challenges the idea that time flows uniformly in perception. Instead, it suggests that time is reconstructed after the fact, shaped by sensory and cognitive processes. Chronostasis reveals how the brain edits experience to maintain coherence. Moments are not merely observed. They are assembled, corrected, and smoothed into continuity. In this way, the illusion serves a practical purpose. Without it, perception would feel fragmented and unstable. The brain sacrifices precision to preserve order. Chronostasis stands as a quiet reminder that the present moment is not always perceived in real time. It is shaped by memory, prediction, and reconstruction. The pause that feels real is not a failure of perception, but a feature of it. Time as experienced is not fixed. It is a construction, maintained moment by the mind. Depersonalization-Derealization Disorder. Depersonalization-Derealization Disorder is a psychological condition characterized by a persistent sense of detachment from the self, the surrounding world, or both. The individual feels separated from their thoughts, body, or emotions, while reality itself may appear distant, artificial, or unreal. Despite this, awareness remains intact. In depersonalization, the person experiences themselves as an observer rather than a participant. Thoughts may feel distant, emotions muted, and bodily sensations altered. Actions continue, but they feel automatic, as though occurring without personal involvement. Derealization affects the perception of the external world. The environment may appear flat, foggy, or staged. Colors can seem dull or overly sharp. Sounds may feel distant or artificial. The world remains recognizable, but its emotional depth is diminished. A defining feature of this disorder is insight. Individuals understand that their experience is subjective. They know the world has not truly changed and that they have not lost themselves. This awareness distinguishes the condition from psychotic disorders. The onset of depersonalization-derealization can be sudden or gradual. It often follows periods of intense stress, anxiety, or emotional overload. However, it can also appear without a clearly identifiable trigger, making its origin difficult to determine. The experience is often described as emotionally neutral rather than frightening. Fear may arise in response to the sensation, but the condition itself is marked by numbness. Emotional reactions feel distant, as though filtered through a barrier. Neurologically, the disorder is thought to involve altered regulation of emotional processing. The brain reduces emotional intensity as a protective response. This dampening creates a sense of safety at the cost of emotional connection. The disorder does not impair memory, intelligence, or logical reasoning. Individuals can function normally in daily life, often appearing unaffected to others. The struggle occurs internally, within subjective experience. Depersonalization-derealization can persist for extended periods. For some, it lasts days or weeks. For others, it becomes chronic. The intensity may fluctuate, but the sense of detachment remains consistent. The condition highlights the role of emotion in grounding reality. The feeling of being real and present depends not only on perception, but on emotional resonance. When emotion is suppressed, reality feels hollow. Importantly, depersonalization-derealization is not rare. Mild, temporary episodes occur in many people at some point in life. The disorder is diagnosed when the experience becomes persistent and distressing. There is no single cause that explains why the condition becomes chronic in some individuals. Similar stressors do not produce the same outcome in others. This variability remains one of the disorder's most puzzling aspects. The experience does not involve loss of identity. The individual knows who they are, but feels disconnected from that knowledge. Identity becomes intellectual rather than felt. Depersonalization-derealization reveals how closely reality is tied to emotional engagement. Without emotional depth, perception becomes distant and mechanical. The disorder represents a shift in how consciousness is regulated. The mind remains active and aware, but emotionally withdrawn. This withdrawal alters the texture of experience without altering its structure. Depersonalization-Derealization Disorder stands as a powerful example of how the mind can distance itself from experience in the absence of physical danger. It is not a collapse of consciousness, but a quiet retreat from immediacy. When presence fades, reality continues, but it feels unreachable. The world remains intact, yet the connection to it feels thin and fragile. The Mandela Effect. The Mandela Effect is a psychological phenomenon in which large groups of people share the same false memory. The memory feels vivid, detailed, and emotionally certain, yet it does not align with documented reality. What makes this effect distinctive is not individual error, but collective agreement. The term originated from widespread reports of people remembering Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s, despite historical records showing he was released and later became president of South Africa. The discrepancy drew attention to how confidently incorrect memories can be shared by many. In the Mandela Effect, individuals do not experience doubt. The memory feels complete, stable, and internally consistent. It is often accompanied by a strong sense of certainty, reinforced by discovering that others remember the same thing. These shared memories frequently involve cultural details. Movie quotes, brand logos, historical events, and well-known names are common examples. The memories often feel too specific to be dismissed as vague confusion. From a cognitive perspective, memory is not a fixed recording of events. It is a reconstructive process. Each time a memory is recalled, it is rebuilt using fragments of information, expectation, and context. Over time, this reconstruction can drift away from the original source. Social reinforcement plays a significant role. When individuals encounter others who share the same memory, confidence increases. The memory feels validated, not questioned. Agreement replaces verification. The Mandela Effect does not require deception or misinformation. In many cases, there is no clear source for the false memory. It emerges naturally through repeated reconstruction and shared cultural exposure. Emotion strengthens these memories. Familiarity, nostalgia, and personal meaning make certain details feel permanent. When reality contradicts them, the contradiction feels unsettling. Importantly, individuals experiencing the Mandela Effect do not suffer from memory impairment. Their cognitive functioning explains nothing unusual. The false memory exists alongside accurate ones, not instead of them. The phenomenon highlights how memory prioritizes coherence over accuracy. The mind prefers a stable narrative, even if some details are incorrect. Consistency feels more important than precision. There is no definitive explanation for why some false memories become widely shared while others remain individual. Many errors occur silently, but only a few become collective. The Mandela Effect reveals the social nature of memory. Memory does not exist in isolation. It is shaped by language, culture, and shared narratives. The effect challenges the assumption that confidence equals correctness. A memory can feel deeply real while being entirely wrong. Despite its popularity, the Mandela Effect remains a subject of debate. While psychological explanations account for much of it, the exact pathways through which identical false memories emerge in large groups remain unclear. The phenomenon demonstrates that memory is not a record of reality, but a story continuously rewritten. What feels remembered may be an agreement rather than a fact. The Mandela Effect stands as a reminder that human memory is powerful, persuasive, and fragile. When many minds remember the same thing incorrectly, reality itself feels negotiable. Ending. These psychological effects remind us that the human mind does not simply observe reality. It interprets it. Perception, memory, identity, and time are shaped quietly, moment by moment, often without a clear cause. What feels solid can shift. What feels certain can change. If this journey felt familiar or resonated in some way, take a moment to reflect on it. If you found this video meaningful, support the channel with a like and subscribe for more calm explorations of the mind. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments and let others know how these effects connect to your own experience. And if you think this video might speak to someone else, share it with them. Thank you for being here.